I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming. Something funny happened in the world without many people noticing it, or if they noticed it, without many people talking about it. It used to be that if you wanted to get information, you had to go to a physical building somewhere and be very quiet and look through a card catalog and then find yourself in a stack where there was a book. And then you'd leaf through to find the pages that you were looking for, and maybe the fact you were looking for wasn't actually in the book. The process of acquiring information took anywhere from hours to days to weeks, and it sometimes involved trips to far-flung archives or trying to locate an expert and then calling them on the phone and hoping they would answer the phone. Now all of that happens instantaneously. That's the thing that's changed that people haven't really talked about in terms of education. And what more fitting place to talk about it than at a high school in Chicago? One of the great cities of the world, right? A great high school in a great city. The bad news is that high schools in general, I don't know enough about this particular high school, but I do meet with educators and school boards all over the country. High schools in general and universities have not kept up with the fact that students don't need to know how to find information. They know how to get it. And we don't need to do what we've been doing for hundreds of years, which is spending our time as educators and parents and grandparents and older brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. We don't need to spend all that time trying to shove facts into young brains, because those young brains are going to get the facts without us, right? We used to, when it was hard to come by, we'd have people memorize things like the sun is 93 million miles away, or in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Nobody needs to remember those things anymore. They can get it in half a second. As the New Yorker writer Adam Gopnik explained, by the time a teacher elucidates the difference between the words elegy and eulogy, everybody in the class has already Googled it. So what this means is that the primary mission of educators and parents has to change. It's no longer about conveying information. It's about teaching people what to do with that information, how to be critical of different sources of information, how to know whether the information you're getting is accurate or timely or true, as opposed to somebody trying to put something over on you. And our primary mission has to shift to tell young people, once they get that information and they've critically evaluated it, how can they use it in creative and interesting ways to help make the world a better place? And so that's why I think critical thinking is important now more than ever. And I'd like to start with a thought. I'm curious to know what you think of this. It ain't what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. How many people are familiar with this Mark Twain quote? So I saw it in the film The Big Short. You may remember it. It filled the screen. And a few years earlier, Al Gore used it in his movie An Inconvenient Truth. And it's been around. Walter Mondale said something very much like it. It ain't what you know for sure that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So what does it mean? I think the implication is that if you think you know something for sure, and you're so certain that you know it, and it's something that's not true, that can lead to calamity, disaster. And this plays out in boardrooms all across the country. It plays out in the White House, in government, in personal decision-making, when we go headstrong into a plan of action without considering that maybe we're wrong. We're so sure that we're right, and this can lead to all kinds of disasters. Medical decisions, too. A story that affected a lot of people is the story of Steve Jobs, who, near the height of his career, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And being the Northern Californian hippy-dippy kind of guy that he was, he decided that he wasn't going to go in for traditional medical, standard medical treatments. He did a few searches on the web. This is well documented by Walter Isaacson, his biographer, and some interviews that Mr. Jobs and his family did. he found that there was a way that he could beat the cancer by changing his diet and using some alternative medicine approaches. And so that's what he resolved to do. And when they didn't work, by the time he realized they weren't working, it was too late for medicine to help him, and he died. So you don't get any more serious a decision than that. And he wasn't suitably skeptical. In the mind of a critical thinker, alternative medicine is really a misleading phrase. Because if something has been shown to work, we call it medicine. If it lacks any evidence, we call it alternative medicine. And then for a while we study it, and if it turns out we've got evidence, we don't keep calling it alternative medicine. At that point, when there's evidence, it's just plain old medicine. So it's not the case that all alternative medicines are faulty or that they don't work. It's just that there's no evidence that they do, because once they work, they're medicine. So it's also not the case that all medicine is properly applied, or that all doctors know what they're doing, or that all medicine helps. But the big theme of my talk tonight, and a view that I'm trying to impress upon high school students, actually anybody over the age of 12, is that it's very difficult in this world to be certain about very much. So you've got to play the statistics. You've got to look where it's more likely. And it's more likely that you'll find a cure with a doctor who's been trained and with medicine than finding it on the web with some pills that cost $60 a bottle that really don't have anything in them besides green tea and a single amino acid that everybody gets every day anyhow. I mention this because I just did a radio interview on one of your Chicago radio stations, an AM station, and they had this ad for this product that they were trying to sell people because it increased circulation, and it supposedly increased circulation and blood oxygenation and alertness and all these things. And so I went and I looked at what the ingredients were, and it was about a sip's worth of green tea, and it was this amino acid that is present in everybody's diet, and a couple of inert ingredients. And they were doing a booming business among some uncritical thinkers, I'm afraid. I don't think it causes you any harm to take this stuff. It's just that, if you can afford to waste $60 a month, it doesn't cause any harm. But I digress. In order to live in a world where you can accept that you can't really be sure about a whole lot, you have to embrace something that, again, another Californian, the California, transplanted to California from England, philosopher Alan Watts talked about in the 1970s. Some of you may remember reading a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity, that insecurity is actually a more favorable approach to life. Again, coming back to the Twain quote, if you're insecure about your knowledge, you're more likely to put systems in place that will prevent you from having a disaster if things don't work out the way you planned, right? It's only the person who's absolutely sure they know what they're doing that can get into special kinds of trouble, as opposed to others who have backup plans. By the way, I hope you don't mind me using my notes. This is only the second time I've talked about the book, and it's helping me to keep track. This kind of inquisitiveness that comes from being open-minded to the fact that there might be new information out there, the kind of inquisitiveness and question-asking that I'm promoting is innate in all of us. We're born with it. We're a questioning species. It's hardwired into the brain. I can tell you this as a neuroscientist. And you know it if you've ever seen a 4-year-old at bedtime, and you say to the 4-year-old, it's time to go to bed, and they say, why? And you say, because it's your bedtime, and they say, why? And you say, well, because you need a good night's sleep. Because if you don't get a good night's sleep, you won't be rested in the morning. And so on. So that kind of innate inquisitiveness and curiosity gets beaten out of most of us by parents and teachers who become impatient after the long string of these. But I'm suggesting that we go back to being 4-year-olds and we do ask why. How do you know that? Why do you think that's true? Where does that information come from? So think like a 4-year-old. That's my first tip. And I want to talk about some specific cases of critical thinking that affect us, especially now in an election year. We're reading a lot of averages. The average voter believes this, the average Democrat believes that, the average gun owner, and so on, right? And the thing to know about averages is that they're tricky. They're a deception. Now, I understand Nate Silver has made a career out of averaging polls together, but you have to be very careful when you're looking at an average because they're distortions. That is, you're taking a whole bunch of numbers and you're reducing them to a single number. So you're distorting things. Let me give you an example. Suppose I tell you that there's a room not far from here, and the net worth, the average net worth of people in that room is $5 billion. Now, suppose that you are working for an investment brokerage firm, or that you're a salesman who sells high-priced cars, or you're a realtor, or maybe you work for the IRS. In any case, this room that has 10 people in it, the average net worth of whom is $5 billion, you want to be in that room. But what if I tell you that that room has Mark Zuckerberg, a net worth about $45–50 billion, and 9 indigent people? Right? Now the room seems less like a place you might want to invest your resources, and the average hasn't really told you anything about the room. You've got this broad range of values in there, and the average doesn't capture it. I mean, using averages, I could say that the average human being has 1 testicle. It's true. But it doesn't really tell you about the kinds of human beings you're going to run into, right? Here's another example. I just read from the Pew Research Center, Americans read an average mean of 12 books a year. Well, think about that. I don't doubt the Pew Research Center. I think that number is probably accurate, but I wonder what that really tells me about the average American reader. I don't know who the average American is, but average reader reads 12 books a year. Well, what if you had a whole bunch of people reading 24 books a year and a whole bunch of other people reading no books a year? The average would be 12, but 12 is a number that nobody actually reads. They're either reading 0 or 24. So this is a problem with averages. And you also have to keep track of, I don't mean to get too technical. This is as technical as I'm going to get. Lonnie mentioned math, but nothing I'm talking about requires anything more than, I think, 5th grade arithmetic. There's no math involved. But there are 3 kinds of averages. Statisticians, researchers, pollsters. There are 3 different kinds of averages, and they're lumped together by a single word, average, and you have to know which is which. So I've been talking about the mean. You know how to obtain that. You add up all the numbers, and you divide by the number of people or the number of widgets that you were counting or whatever it is. But there are 2 other kinds, the median and the mode. The median is the value in the center of the distribution, meaning half the observations are below it and half are above it. So the median in my book example, if you had a whole bunch of people who read 24 books, a whole bunch of people who read none, and suppose there's 1 person that read 12, that's the median. But median doesn't really capture the reality either, does it? And then the 3rd kind of average is the mode. That's the value that occurs most often. And so when we talk about IQ, the mean happens to be 100 or so in our country. That's the average mean. The mode is also about 100, and the median is about 100. It's a special case of a mound-shaped normal distribution, we call it. You don't need to know all these details. All you need to know is that the next time you see an average reported, ask yourself if they're telling you which one it is, and more importantly, ask yourself if that single number could be hiding a really interesting story that they're not telling you, because the average is a distortion. There are other ways that we can be hoodwinked by journalists and ad people who are not really doing their jobs, or who are doing their jobs and they're trying to take advantage of you. So how many of you remember the claim 4 out of 5 dentists surveyed recommend Colgate for their patients? You remember this? Well, Colgate was sued by a competitor. And the competitor went to court, and the competitor didn't deny that 4 out of 5 dentists recommended Colgate, but it was the implication, the unspoken implication, that 4 out of 5 dentists recommended Colgate to the exclusion of other toothpastes, that they preferred Colgate. And in fact, the way the survey was conducted, the dentists were allowed to list as many as they wanted. List all of the toothpaste that you recommend. So Colgate was listed, and probably Crest and Aquafresh and Gleam and all the rest. As long as they have certain properties, mostly fluoride is the big item, they were recommended. So the implication is what led people to buy Colgate, and the competitor who sued thought that wasn't fair, and a judge and a jury agreed. So critical thinking requires that you ask, am I being told the whole story? And usually in a case of a survey or a poll, you want to know what question was asked and how it was asked. And some of the better news sources, like the New York Times, CBS News, the Nielsen pollsters and the Pew Research Center, they actually either give you in the report these kinds of details, or they provide a link so you can look it up yourself. Problem is, as Lonnie so eloquently said, the internet doesn't have any gatekeepers. It's not like an old public library or an old high school library where the collection was curated, and if you found something in that space, you knew that it was pretty good bet you could trust it. On the internet, there's all kinds of stuff out there that isn't true, and it looks just like the stuff that is. I mean, you go to the grocery store, at the supermarket, and if you see the New York Times or the Washington Post on the newsstand, and you see the National Enquirer, you know that one of them is likely to be more reliable and accurate than the other, and you can sort of tell by the way they look, and you can tell from experience. Here's a case where you can judge a book, or at least a newspaper, by its cover, but on the internet you can't, because the sites that are purveyors of pseudoscience and counter-knowledge and just complete falsity can look very sophisticated, and they can be disguised. Suppose that you want to find out the health value of eating almonds. You heard something, or you read something that almonds are the new superfood. So you look into it, and you ended up at a website called AmericansForBetterHealthcare.org. Well, one question to ask is, who operates the website? Is it possible that it's a shill organization for the almond growers of America? You have to look into these things. There's no gatekeeper. You have to look. Occasionally you get some help from Snopes.com, or for political things from PolitiFact and the Washington Post, who have great fact-checking sites. But we're basically all on our own. All that time we're saving by not having to go to the library, the kind of Faustian bargain that we've all implicitly made with the powers that be, is that we saved hours and hours of information acquisition, and we have to spend some of that trying to verify what we find. One way to do that is with plausibility checks. As soon as you hear something, ask yourself if it's plausible. Suppose you hear, well, this happened to me. I was getting my hair cut last week, and I'm just curious, how many people know what the population of the world is? Just a rough idea. 6 billion? Does that sound like in the realm of possibility? 7 billion? Well, there's a website that tracks this. This guy's about to Google it. There's a website that keeps track of this stuff. I haven't looked at it in a while. The last time I looked, it was a little over 7 billion. I suppose it could have crept up to 8 billion when I wasn't paying attention. I don't think it crept up to 9 billion. And there wasn't some mass die-off of people that would have made it drop to 6 billion, not that I know of. I would have heard about it. We all would have heard about it. So 7 seems, 6 is reasonable, 7 is reasonable. But when the person cutting my hair told me a statistic about 11 billion people in the world lacking access to toilets, I thought, well, that doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't pass a plausibility test. On my way over here tonight, the fellow who drove my taxi over here from the hotel I'm staying in said that he had heard that there were some folks who thought that some buildings in the Loop that looked like office buildings but didn't have any windows, he had heard that they were housing nuclear reactors. And I said, well, I don't know that much about nuclear energy. I'm not an engineer. I'm a simple country neuroscientist. But every picture I've ever seen of a nuclear reactor, there were these smokestacks, and there were all these cooling mechanisms and stuff, and ventilation, and I said, were there any smokestacks or ventilation on this building? No, he said. So it didn't pass plausibility to me that there were all these nuclear reactors in downtown Chicago in the loop that nobody knew about just because the building didn't have any windows. So you have to work through these kinds of things. I think the first thing you do is think about plausibility. Sometimes a claim will be plausible and it's still false, but that's a good first defense. Another way that people will trick you is with graphs. And as Lonnie said, people get intimidated by looking at graphs. And all I would advise anybody to do is just take a breath. Look at the picture and ask yourself, if you've got a graph and there are these axes, this vertical line and this horizontal line, and maybe there's tick marks on it, are there numbers there? One way they can fool you is by leaving the numbers off. Then they can draw anything they want, right? Or maybe they put numbers, but they don't tell you what they are. I saw a poster that was delivered at a conference by a Harvard graduate student who really should know better. And there were these axes, and there were these tick marks, and there were these numbers, but no idea what the numbers were. Was I looking at millivolts of activity on some kind of a sensor? Was I looking at how many seconds it took somebody to respond to a question, or how many neurons were being activated? Maybe it was how many cupcakes the person ate while they were preparing the graph. The numbers could mean anything at all, right? So if somebody doesn't put the numbers, they're either trying to put one over on you, or they don't know better. And that happens a lot. Sometimes it's not their fault. Somebody's put in a position where they have to make a graph. They're a graphic artist, they're trained as an artist, but they don't have any statistical training. But you know better. So you don't have to put too much stock in those. One of my favorite examples of this comes from, anybody here work for Fox News? Anybody? What's that?
Fair and balanced.
Yes, nobody works for Fox News. They've been a wonderful source of entertainment for me as I put this book together because their graphics department is so fun. They ran a story on television about what was going to happen if the Bush tax cuts expired during Obama's presidency. And there was going to be a change in the tax rate for many Americans from the top tax rate for many Americans was going to go up from 35% to 40%. Now that means that those Americans would end up paying 13% more tax. So you can imagine you might graph the percentages on the y-axis in a couple of rectangle bar graphs, right? So you've got the 35% graph here, and then the 40% graph here, and visually you can see that the difference in the height represents a difference of about 13%. But if you have an agenda, that's not a very emotionally provocative graph. It's not going to get anybody up in arms and writing to their congressman and stuff, 13%. So why not, instead of starting the graph at 0 down here and having it go up to 35 and 40, why not start the axis at 34%, so that now it looks like this. 34 is here, 40 is here, and this looks 5 or 6 times as big as this. The visual impression is at odds with what the numbers say, but most people don't bother to look at the numbers. That's what they're counting on. But you know better, so don't let that happen to you. Look at the numbers. So another thing is polls. There's a lot wrong with polls. One of the problems is that if they don't give you the margin of error, you can say anything you want. It's like not putting units on the numbers on a graph. The margin of error is a statistical calculation. It has to do with how many people were surveyed. There are formulas for it. In my book, I point you to a website where you can plug in the numbers. The next time you read a poll and it says we surveyed 2,300 Americans, you just plug in the number 2,300 and it'll tell you what the margin of error was. Simple as that. So without a margin of error, you don't know much. If they tell you that 47% of the country are supporting Trump with a margin of error of 3%, you know that means that within statistical accuracy, there's between 44% and 50% of the country, that the number is plus or minus 3% from the number they gave you. But if they don't give you a 3% margin of error, it really could be anything. So I have an adorable dachshund named Winifred. She's 19 years old. She's lived a good long life. She's a write-in candidate for mayor of San Jose. And I can tell you that she is the leading candidate with a margin of error of 100%. Vote Winifred. And then the other question is, who responded to the poll, right? Is it a random sample? If I stand in front of a horse betting track and I only ask people there, am I getting a representative sample? If I meet people outside of the NRA, is that a representative? The NRA headquarters, is that a representative sample? Probably not. So the whole point of sampling is that we want to ask people that are representative of the country. And the way we do that is we try to, we do what's called a random sample, and that's just, all that means is that everybody in the country, in theory, has an equal chance of being asked. They're equally likely to be asked. Now, we're only going to sample 2,000 or 3,000 of them because it's too costly and time-consuming and actually impossible to talk to everybody in the country. But it turns out that if you do your sampling properly, if you ask the right question of a random group of people, you can get very, very accurate answers about what 300 million people are going to do from talking to fewer than 2,500 of them. But you have to do your study properly. And they should tell you something about the methods. Some things to look out for is that if you're doing your survey by landline, telephone landlines, that's going to skew towards older people because younger people don't have landlines. It's also going to leave out the homeless and people who are, on the road, traveling salesmen, traveling musicians. You can see the problem, right? If you're sampling only cell phones, it's going to skew towards the young and whatever biases there might be in that. Maybe you decide to stop people in front of Whole Foods, but then you're only getting people who shop at Whole Foods. Maybe you decide you're going to go to different cities and rural areas and stop people on the street, but the kind of people who will stop doing what they're doing to talk to a pollster may not be representative of the country because there's a whole bunch of people who don't want to talk to a pollster or reveal their voting preferences. Then you got people who will tell a pollster one thing but then actually vote for another candidate, either because they think the pollster wants to hear one thing or they want to shock the pollster or they change their mind. So it's very complicated. If you're wondering why the polls are flip-flopping so much, it's because sampling has gotten more difficult. It's not like it was in the 60s where you could just call people on the phone at home. People are more mobile. It's a much more complicated country. The other problem is that, and I'm not a political scientist, so I'm only speculating, but maybe you share this intuition. And I'll just point out that scientific studies come from intuitions. We observe something, and then we go out and study it in order to see if our intuition was right or not. My intuition is that this particular presidential election, more so than any other in my lifetime, I was born in 1957, so the first election I voted in was 1976, a presidential election. Just to give you an idea of the span of presidential elections I'm aware of. In my lifetime, I don't think there was an election so driven by a single issue, by single-issue voters. Now, I don't mean that the candidates are talking about only a single issue, but voters certainly are. There's a substantial number of people who decided, if you're going to take my gun away from me, I don't care what else you're going to do for the country, I'm not voting for you. Or the opposite. As long as you let me keep my gun, you can do anything else you want. Or it could be around immigration, or taxes, or the environment. People who have focused on a single issue that's important to them, and they're not willing to entertain the possibility that they could get a whole bunch of other things they want if they'd be a little bit flexible about this one. I'm not saying that that's an irrational way to be. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying it makes the polling more difficult because you end up, each time you do a poll, it's possible you end up with a bunch of different single-issue voters. And so that's another reason the polls tend to flip-flop. And the particular question that gets asked is crucial. The way you ask a question and the way you frame it can completely change the way people will respond to a poll. So if you say, if you ask a question like, 90% of the people in your community are in favor of Proposition 17, and nobody is opposed to it that is of any consequence. Are you in favor of Proposition 17? You get different answers than if you phrase it in the reverse, or if you even phrase it neutrally, like, are you in favor of Proposition 17? Or, what about this? Could you imagine a circumstance in which you would vote for Hillary Clinton? And so, maybe 85% of people can imagine a circumstance in which they'd vote for Hillary Clinton. Maybe some of them would vote for Hillary Clinton if it turned out she was Donald Trump. I don't know. Maybe they can imagine the circumstance. And so then you say, oh, well, 85% of people say they could vote for Hillary Clinton. I got my funny chimera in my head now. So you see the problem with polls, that it all comes down to the way they're conducted. The point here is that we tend to think of statistics as being incontrovertible and cold, hard facts because there's a number on them. But I almost called the book Statistics Are People Too. But they're not. But the thing is, statistics are gathered by people. Some of those people are well-intentioned, some are not. Some of them are qualified and well-trained, many of them are not. And so it's true that although the statistics don't lie, the way that they're presented can profoundly distort the take-home message that you end up with. I'd like to go through a few other critical thinking ideas. Don't believe something just because everybody else does. In Latin, that's called the argumentum ad populum. Now, you may have heard of the wisdom of the crowds. That's actually of limited applicability. It's good for judging things like how many jelly beans there are in a jar. It's not good for judging big social issues. I mean, we had slavery for a long, long time because everybody did it. Everybody believed in it, right? And as St. Augustine said, right is right even if no one is doing it. Wrong is wrong even if everyone is doing it. So you have to think for yourself about what's right and wrong and what's true and what's not, because relying on the crowds can have you making bad decisions. Don't believe something just because there's a fancy website behind it. Don't reject a source just because it's occasionally wrong. Don't accept one just because it got one or two high-profile things right. The New York Times is widely regarded by people who study such things as being among the best of the very best news sources in this country. Now, you may not like the way they present the news, you may find them biased, but they work really hard not to be biased, and their success record at reporting true and accurate stories is higher than any other publication or news broadcast, according to many expert sources, again, that track these kinds of things. But they make mistakes. You've probably read mistakes in them yourself. You've probably noticed mistakes. Every day on page 2, they print a whole bunch of retractions or corrections. But they are correcting themselves. They're taking the effort to do that. And they do make an effort to try and get both sides of a story. So don't reject them just because they make mistakes. They're still pretty good. Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, they're pretty good. TMZ, not so good. Now, they're occasionally right. They broke the story of Michael Jackson's death before anybody else did because they were willing to publish a story based on a single witness. In the meantime, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, the New York Times, they were trying to get a second person to corroborate the story, and it took them a couple hours. And so they had the story later. But just because TMZ got it right once doesn't mean that they're going to get everything right. I picked up a National Enquirer the other day, and they actually had a story in there that was true. But like I said at the beginning, you got to play the odds. Where are you most likely to find something correct? Another one, correlation doesn't equal causation. Have you heard this before? Just because two things change together, one goes up and the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down, just because that happens doesn't mean one caused the other. I saw a statistic this morning that ice cream sales are up in the Chicago metropolitan area this week, and so is the incidence of people wearing short pants. Now, I don't think that one is causing the other. I don't think that people are buying ice cream and thinking, oh, I have to put on short pants now, and they're not finding themselves in shorts and saying, oh, ice cream time. There's this third factor that's causing both, which is, of course, the high temperatures. But there can be correlations that perfectly track things, and there's no third factor that accounts for it. That day over the summer when the stock market reached a peak, I happened to see a whale jump out of the ocean. I don't think that one caused the other, and I don't think there was a third factor that caused both. I don't think the whale heard about the stock market and decided to jump gleefully out, and I don't think the stock market was responding to a single whale in the Pacific Ocean. Coincidences happen. So the thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to make a leap to causation just because things go together. And a lot of people will do this. Scientists make the mistake all the time. You can be on the watch for it. That's an easy one to spot. Missing control condition is another one. If you hear about a study or an experiment that shows that something is so, ask yourself, what was the control condition? I give you some new medication, it cures your headache. How do I know if your headache would have gotten better anyway without it? I need a control group. I need a bunch of people with headaches, and I need to have half of them take the new drug and half of them take aspirin or nothing, and just compare like that. If you don't have the control group, you don't really know what you think you know. And control groups pop up in other places. So there was a story about a wealthy white socialite in the Upper East Side of Manhattan who couldn't understand what all this fuss was about police being racist. She said, all my interactions with those nice police officers have been so pleasant. They help me across the street, they help me carry my groceries up, but there's no control condition here. Her economic class, the neighborhood she lives in, her race, may be contributing to the tenor of those interactions. We don't know unless we stop and look at the control condition. Now, I began with that quote by Mark Twain, "It ain't what you know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And I have some bad news. Mark Twain didn't say that, which I find kind of ironic, because the people who made those two films, the Al Gore film and The Big Short, were so sure that Mark Twain said it that they didn't bother to check. But I checked for the Field Guide to Lies, the book I'm talking about tonight. I checked, and there's nothing in any of Twain's writings that indicate that he ever said that or wrote that. And I even looked in the writings of some of his contemporaries, like Bret Harte. Bret Harte didn't say it. It was once falsely attributed to Will Rogers. He didn't say it. Nobody said it, as far as I can tell. It just sort of appeared around the time of the Al Gore film. So why would we believe that something like that might be true? Well, it kind of sounds like him. Right. I mean, it's got the word ain't, and it's got it in there twice. And the phrase just ain't so, I mean, that's got this kind of Twainian, American humorist kind of ring to it. It seems plausible, but plausibility doesn't mean fact, right? So I love the irony of this, that a whole bunch of people whose jobs it was, film producers and fact checkers and screenwriters, their job is to check facts, and it got by all of them. And you know how I found it out? I'm a professional researcher. I got stumped after 2 days of looking for it in different quotation dictionaries and such, and on the web. And so I finally turned to a librarian. For those of you that haven't had experience with librarians in a while, they're not just the people who shush you in an elementary school library. Being a librarian requires a lot of training. At the university where I work, they're the equivalent of professors. They've got degrees in information science. They're very knowledgeable. They're a great resource. I couldn't have written any of my books or scientific papers without our university librarians. They're a tremendous resource, and I recommend that you get to know one or two of them. But the librarian who helped me, Gretchen Lieb, who's the librarian, one of the librarians at Vassar College, actually was able to track down some similar sentiments in some writings from the late 1800s, but nothing with that formulation. So it's an interesting kind of thing. I think what it tells us is that, hang on. What it tells us is that sometimes you just don't know what you think you do. And I think our biggest and most powerful weapon in an age of a lot of lies and distortions is humility. If we approach the world and we approach the information that we encounter with a humility that maybe we don't know everything, then we have the chance to learn. You can't learn anything if you know everything. And one of the other funny things about this election, as stark as the contrast is, it strikes me that there are a whole bunch of people in this country who decided a long time ago which candidate they were going to support. And they don't want to hear anything against that candidate, and they don't want to hear anything good about the opponent. And that's led to a kind of lack of dialogue and a closed-mindedness. And, you know, maybe some of these people were wrong in their choice of the candidate. And there's new information coming in all the time. We scientists have a fancy name for what happens when new information comes in and you take it into account. The name is called Bayesian Inferencing. And don't let that bother you. It sounds kind of erudite. It's just a bunch of people trying to be fancy. It doesn't mean anything more than, as new information comes in, you might want to modify your prior held beliefs. But science is based on that. That's what we do. We look at a new study, we see whether it changes our minds about whether you should eat meats, red meat or not, whether you should have a diet that's high in fat or low in fat. You've probably followed the stories in the last few weeks. Now they say that flossing isn't that important. There's no evidence that it works. They used to tell you you had to floss. Yes, things change. You have to be willing to live in an open-ended state where you're willing to change your mind once in a while. And I think that's what critical thinking is. I'd be delighted to be able to take your questions. Thank you so much for inviting me here.